Okay, Buongiorno, finally back with you after a lot of fits and starts and a change of locale that was necessitated due to the fact that the Tichenor building was closed. You may be asking about the hard hat. Well, Buongiorno has decided to inhabit until this COVID-19 thing runs its course. Buongiorno has decided to retire to his subterranean bunker some 350 yards underneath the earth. Alright? But Buongiorno, being stupid, decided to build it directly underneath an abandoned fracking tunnel, which is very, very unstable. So if you can hear by the echo and such that we are deep underground, but it's very unstable. So I'm wearing this hard hat because on occasion, a stalactite, I think the stalactites are the ones that go down, will shimmy off and strike. One actually knocked me out last night. So it's about being protective both against the disease and against falling. I gotta make it funny, you guys. I've gotta make it funny. I've gotta keep it lighthearted, especially in these times of uncertainty and these times of not having any money. Actually, I'm doing this from my home, and hopefully I've set up the apparatus so that we can just dig right in. But what happened? All right, let's get to some of the things that we need to get to really quick. Let's change the aperture a little bit so that you can see. Okay. As I had said, according to an email, Jerry Smith and I were supposed to do a presentation. Jerry Smith, the the retired Broome County historian, we were going to do a presentation in Tichenor on Monday. We had the whole thing scheduled to be done, and we got up there and found out that the building had been sanitized for your protection. There was this white band around it like you get when you go to a hotel room. And I tried to get public safety, Broome public safety people. Sorry about that. To come and make an exception. Of course, there was a lot of no, we're not going to do it. So Jerry we even went as far as attempting to do it off site. And then Jerry's wife, unfortunately, has some type of medical condition that had flared up, and we needed to postpone for the time being. But it's like I had said in the email, those of you who had actually sent questions in for Jerry, that will count as credit, and we're going to try to reschedule. We're going to try to reschedule for sometime late in April. So that's that. It's unfortunate, but I mean it's unfortunate times. It's unfortunate times. There's a lot of things going on, but hopefully we can still get up on Arthur Berger. He's in Mexico, and he told me to contact him sometime early in the month, so we'll see how that goes. Another big bullet point before we get into the stuff for today. Book report. I pushed back, you should all be jumping up and down with hurrahs. I pushed the book report back to April 20th, which is a Monday. So that pushes it back almost a month. And you should be checking your email box because I sent out a handout of the guidelines that I'm not going to go over. I'm not going to spend the time to go over them right now. We can talk about those later, but it gives you a general orientation of how you should be presenting the book. And you've got a few different options to do that. And if you have any questions, just contact me via email. So that's been pushed back. and you can do it in a lot of different formats. So there's that. So you should be at least working on the book, reading the book, and somewhere into the book. You should have it in your possession by now. And it should be interesting. Hopefully we can do some kind of interactive format with it where people can respond to them either via Blackboard or via the blog. Hopefully you guys are looking at some of the things on the blog. And so there's that. I want to get back into Chapter 4 on rhetoric, which I had already started at the end of the last lecture, and I want to get back into now. And it comes right after semiotics. And what we had kind of left, the idea that we had left on was the idea that semiotics and rhetoric are somewhat related to a certain degree, but they're similar in many ways because they both generate meaning, right? Semiotics consist of the study of signs, and we'll find that rhetoric is really more about the study of the ways in which signs affect and change, cause an effect, cause a qualitative change. I'm trying to think of like the most comprehensive way of distinguishing between semiotics and rhetoric, and I think that Berger gets into it also. But this idea that with semiotics and signs comprise meaning, but they don't necessarily affect people like AFFECT, affect people in the ways in which rhetoric is designed to cause some type of qualitative effect in your mind or your heart or both. And we're going to talk about the ways in which that definition of rhetoric has gotten wider over the years, certainly since dusty old Aristotle defined it. Oh, here we go. Dusty old Aristotle defined it back in the a long time ago. All right, but his Aristotle's definition of rhetoric still holds a lot of weight. Aristotle was very, very brilliant, and we still go back to him when it comes to studying. It's like I remember being at NYU and reading Aristotle's Poetics. It's like there's still a lot there that is applicable to our present time, and we'll talk about that. Aristotle talks about three different modes of persuasion. All right, that three very distinct dimensions to this idea of rhetoric. The one being ethos, which we understand ethos as, the term ethic comes from ethics, ethical, and it is that persuasive capacity, the character of a person's credibility. A person's credibility, say, a person on, there's a lot of difference, say, between the guy down in Washington Square Park that is off of his meds and is standing on a soapbox screaming about the end of the world. He might actually be like, right, as opposed to, a congressman or a senator or somebody or an academic of some type. The idea of credibility, and that's ethos, right? The credibility of the speaker, the personal character of the speaker. Can he be believed? Can he or she be believed? The next thing is pathos, right? Pathos is a word that is still used, even though it has a Greek origin. It's the idea of being able to stir emotions in a listener. Being able to elicit certain emotions, impassioned speech. When we're having an argument, when we're having a debate, even at times when I'm lecturing about things, I get a little bit, over the top about things that I am, passionate about or pissed off about, and it's that element. It's the emotional element, and then logos. Logos basically is a word that means the word, the logos. Even in the Bible, the Gospel of John starts, the first lines are, the logos is always equated with God. In the beginning was the logos. The idea of this kind of divine order, but for our purposes, the logos is the logical arguments in speech. Are they logical? Do they hold water? Do they make sense to consensual reality? And these will be the first things that Berger will talk about. Okay, he says we can see all three of Aristotle's modes of persuasion in medical television commercials in which a physician appears, and that's become like a cliche. The doctor appearing in the commercial. I'm a doctor. It used to be they used to get guys that used to play doctors. I'm not a doctor, but I used to play one on television to come and add an air of authority. Of course, it was BS, but it was persuasive. A guy in a white coat usually denotes something that is persuasive. Berger goes on. Aristotle wrote another book called The Poetics. The Poetics is if rhetoric is about logical debate and discussion, Poetics is really about the elements of what makes something comic or tragic, and the book is almost always read in conjunction with courses on Greek tragedy or Greek comedy, but also in a lot of theater classes. We used to read it in NYU film classes, like on screenwriting, because it still holds up. Some of its dynamics, some of the ideas that it talks about seem to be universal things, but it's also very limiting and stringent, to the degree that Aristotle is defining things very narrowly. Like, in order for something to be a narrative, it needs to have this, it needs to have that. And in our postmodern, crazy mashup, anime, meme-filled age, these things get played with very fast and loose. But it's good to know, I always say to students, especially when they're making films or they're writing and they're doing stuff like that, it's best, you need to really know the conventions of something. You should know the right way of doing something before, in any art form. It's like you should learn the rudiments and become, competent in the rudiments before you start breaking those things. You should know what you're breaking, So he wrote this book called The Poetics. About tragedy and comedy, the nature of plot, what constitutes a plot, and related matters. But for our purposes, we can think of poetics as part of rhetoric, although some scholars don't agree with this. Some scholars don't agree with it. But for our purposes, we can think of poetics as part of rhetoric, although some scholars would not agree with this. Our focus is not limited to argumentation per se, as in speeches and debates, but is on persuasion in a broader sense. That is, on how creators of all kinds, on all kinds of texts achieve their end. So basically what we're seeing and what Berger wants to talk about is, over time, this definition of what constitutes rhetoric will get a lot wider. It won't just be about, for instance, Mark Antony's speech in Julius Caesar, attempting to make this impassioned case for the execution of Brutus and Cassius. It's not always just about oratory, but it's about other things have rhetorical dimensions to them, characters and dress, and Wayne Booth, one of the people that Berger quotes, will even go as far as saying that rhetoric, films have a rhetoric even when nobody makes a speech in the film itself. There's an ideology, there's a rhetoric, there's a persuasive element to it. So we need to so we ultimately end up widening our focus on what constitutes rhetoric. And he'll quote this guy, Barry Brummett. During all the centuries in which rhetoric was defined primarily in terms of traditional text, people still experienced signs, artifacts, and texts that were not in that traditional form. Informal conversation, architecture, clothing, common entertainment, food. In short, the whole range of cultural artifacts other than traditional rhetorical texts were experienced by people as being influential and moving. The things that we wear to make a statement. The ways in which art operates, and rhetoric usually has to do with intentional strategies, although not always. We'll find out. Usually it's about strategies, and usually it has to do with communicating something specific, an artist or a journalist or a writer attempting to enact a specific change in the audience's mind. Sometimes there's a disconnect there when, for instance, you just don't get it. And we'll talk about that, right? The shift in so it happens in a whole range of different experiences. These things were experienced by people as influential and moving. While rhetorical theorists continued to call only traditional text rhetoric, the shift in understanding raises the question, what changed rhetorically between the 18th century and the present? Are people being influenced by science in different ways now, such that we must call the text of everyday experience rhetorical, but not need to call them that 200 years ago? Have rhetorical theorists awakened to truths that were always there but went unrecognized until recently? In other words, does a change in thinking about what rhetoric is follow from a change in the world or a change in theory? And I think he's getting a little overly pedantic here about, this whole chicken and an egg, what changes. Obviously, things evolve, culture evolves, and things that weren't necessarily seen as being rhetorical. You have to remember, at the time that Aristotle writes, there's no mass media. There's writing has just even started. There's not even printing yet. There's drama, there's art, but all these other things. There's no advertising. There's none of that. So that we needed to widen our definition of what constitutes rhetoric. Berger goes on to talk about rhetoric's connection with the mass media. In the preface to Martin J. Medhurst and Thomas Benson's 1984 book, Rhetorical Dimensions in Media, a critical case book, we find a rationale for applying rhetoric to mass media. They point out that the Greeks and Romans considered rhetoric a very important subject because it played a role in enabling men and women to live together in society. They write, with rhetoric, the attempt by one person or group to influence another through strategically selected and stylized speech, a society could perpetuate itself, debate its internal problems, and decide which norms and values it would follow without resorting to violence. So what they're attempting to say is that rhetoric, had this kind of civilizing, socializing influence on culture that created certain codes of stability or codes of change. In the present day, as they point out, human speech is still the basic means we have of influencing one another. The study of how people choose what to say in a given situation, how to arrange or order your thoughts, select the specific terminology to employ, and decide precisely how they are going to deliver their message is the central focus of rhetorical studies. And we are seeing that. We're seeing a lot of rhetorical strategies going on right now. And what I'm thinking are two of the most overarching, one being the most overarching scenario that we're finding ourselves in with the COVID-19 virus, but also with the upcoming elections. There is a lot going on in the media. There is a lot going on in the newspaper. There is this debate and this open public forum of ideas between researchers and experts about what you should be doing, in order to protect yourself, and in conjunction with that, all the data of reporters and journalists attempting to wrap their heads upon, the way in which this thing is playing out. Is it slowing down? Is it not? What do you need to do? And all of this kind of prescriptive rhetoric to kind of persuade you to stay at home or, wash your hands or all that. In conjunction with that, it's like, the circus of rhetoric at any given time, or it's become a circus really, is the political debates, political campaigns, leading up to an election. These become, petri dishes for like studying rhetoric, studying the strategies of rhetoric, studying the way that people are organizing debates, what they speak about, what they don't want to talk about. For instance, with the pandemic, there's always, a decision-making process on the part of the powers to be to perhaps not want to cause a panic, so that things are carefully and strategically worded, even if it involves resorting to some half-truths sometimes. And we all know how that goes. So that rhetoric, in a way, is historically responsible for things like, causing revolutions, causing certain political movements. It's hard to say. It's like, for instance, you have the great, American revolutionary politician Patrick Henry's great "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. This impassioned, polemical, rhetorical strategy to get the colonies to go to war, right? It's like, there's a great film that I should even show sometime that came out a couple years ago with Gary Oldman playing Winston Churchill. And it's all about Churchill's oratory and Churchill's choice of words and this relationship he had with his wife as he became prime minister to convince the country to go to war. And it's a brilliant meditation on the power of rhetoric, the power of choosing the right words and when. Because all of Parliament, the Prime Minister, everybody around Churchill were really attempting to not go to war, and were doing everything in their power to get him to just shut up, and it's that struggle too. That power struggle is played out, but it's really this celebration of the power of the spoken word, the power of giving speeches. I mean, that also acted in a negative context with what was going on the other side of the English Channel, with guys like Hitler and Mussolini using rhetoric to do all kinds of diabolical things. So, I mean, rhetoric can be used for good or ill. It doesn't have an ethics to it. Rhetoric has a semiotic dimension. We've talked about this. Yes, it does have a semiotic dimension, but it has more to do with technique than the mere communication of data, of meaning. It's more about technique. It's more about its effective qualities. It's like when we walk into a men's room, it's like, we're not being swayed. We're not having our lives changed by looking up at the door and seeing a symbol of a man. It is what it is. Our lives are not changed by certain street signs or certain symbols. Or sometimes a chair is just a chair, as opposed to mass media and oratory and things that are specifically designed to enact some kind of transformation. Sometimes in a whole nation. Sometimes it's like, it happens on the interpersonal level, when we're like, convincing, perhaps somebody, to go out with us or something, or, and it happens on the level of whole nations. And right now it's happening on, there's all these rhetorical undertakings to the whole planet. There's speeches being made to the whole planet in order to stop the spread of the pandemic. So it's got more to do with technique than just the bare bones communication of ideas. And Berger numbers them in intentional persuasion, when my intent is to persuade. But number 2 is a little broader: social values and effects of symbolic forms found in text, whether intentionally placed there or not, right? Sometimes it's like, things are done, and we'll talk a lot more about this later on, and we talk a lot about this. This is almost kind of like a mini image theory lecture, really, because we talk about a lot of this in image theory, so intentional and unintentional meanings of certain things. Sometimes it's like I had said in a prior lecture. Sometimes we, kind of present ourselves in a way that we think is coming off a certain way, and it's not. It's being misinterpreted. We talked about that in semiotics. Techniques by which the arts communicate to audiences. Techniques being, we'll talk about techniques, but genres, editing, music, sound effects, the use of color, the use of specific words, persuasion techniques used by characters in dramatic or narrative works. All right, and that covers a whole range of different. Pick any movie, pick any film, and you'll find something there that is rhetorical. I think of some of the more famous rhetorical films are like The Big Speech that is given in the film Network, or the Big Speech that's given by not Henry Fonda, the other one, and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Those kind of speeches. Number 5, study of genres or types of text. We've kind of gone through this. Number 6, implicit theories about human symbolic interaction implied by authors of symbolic works. All right, what are theory like? And this comes down to things like, what is, for instance, surrealism? What is symbolic poetry? What is lyric poetry? What different genres of that nature, right? What's rhymed verse? What's prose? What's a haiku? Things like that. Number 7, an idea for the conduct of communication among humans. An idea for the conduct of communication. How should we conduct ourselves when we are communicating? What is the most efficacious way of communication? What is the most civil way? You think about things like the United Nations, or diplomatic, or meetings of diplomats, or peace treaty talks, that are all kind of hinged on, certain underlying ideas of promoting peace or getting what you want or whatever. And number 8, the study of what makes form in text effective, known as pragmatics. Is it practical? Does it work? It's one thing to have all kinds of highfalutin ideas and strategies about communicating, but then ultimately the proof is in the pudding. Is this working? Is it effective? And you see a lot of presidential candidates dropping out of the race more often than not due to the fact that their message is not getting out there. You have these whole campaign committees of people deciding how to shape a message to influence hearts and minds, the demographics, the context, what plays in a red state, what plays in a blue state, how I need to present myself to this demographic, to this minority, to this class, to that class, to women, to seniors, all these different pragmatics. He goes on to talk about, and we go through this in Intro to Mass Media, about the basically the dynamics of how communication is even possible, and there's different models, and two of the granddaddies in this are Roman Jacobson, and a guy by the name of Harold Laswell. And it's useful, Berger goes on, it's useful to clarify at this point who is communicating what to whom. I will use a well-known model for the communication process by linguist Roman Jacobson. That Jacobson is saying that when everything is said and done, and we need to break down communication into its particulars, what does every form of communication have? What does every single one have despite everything? And he breaks it down that first there needs to be a sender, right? There needs to be somebody sending the communication. Then there needs to be what is called a channel or a medium, whether it be my voice, what's the medium here that I'm doing today, deep underground. It's a combination of video, audio, PowerPoint, my voice. These are all different elements of the channel that I am using and encoding this lecture to give to you, And it also involves, it's very interesting and complicated due to the fact that it also involves me not doing this in real time, right? Me having to upload this. So it goes through another channel. All these through the internet, and you'll have to play it. It's very, very complicated. This whole idea of channel and code. But some of the things that seem to be common to all forms of communication: language must be investigated in all the varieties of its functions. An outline of these functions demands a concise survey of the factors in any speech event and any act of verbal communication. The addresser, the person that's addressing you, sends a message to the addressee. Think of email. To be operative, the message requires a context. Everything has a context. Every message has a context, right? For a bunch of politicians and doctors and heads of state to be running around right now telling you to stay at home and wear a mask and wash your hands. It's in the context of, if they were saying that 2 years ago, if that was like the biggest priority when there was nothing going on, they would have sounded nuts. So it's a question of the context of the message. The context of the message. Under what conditions is the message being given? There's the old joke about not yelling fire in a crowded movie house. So there's the context. seizable by the addressee, and either verbal or capable of being verbalized. A code. You need a code. Fully or at least partially common to the address. You need to have some kind of consensual language. If you don't know French and I'm doing a, lecture in French, it's kind of pointless, One of my favorite philosophers and intellectuals, Bernard Stiegler, is French. And I watch a lot of his YouTube stuff. And a lot of times I get disconcerted due to the fact that it's in French, and I just don't know French. But there needs to be some consensual. The code has got to be a code in which communication can actually take place. And finally, a contact. What is called a contact here, or a channel. A physical channel and a psychological connection between the addresser and the addressee, enabling both of them to enter into and to stay into communication. This is a question, the psychological dimension of this has to do with attention, too. I mean, I can say all kinds of things. I can give the best lecture in the world. But unless I have your attention, unless there's that psychological element of attention, there's nothing being communicated. If you've decided to zone out, as you occasionally do, and so do I, meaning isn't being. So there's this whole psychological concept of attention that plays into it. Berger goes on to talk about referential, different functions of rhetoric. Right? The referential function involves the surroundings in which the senders find themselves. He made a distinction. He said the message past the syringe means something much different in a medical setting than it does, for instance, in a dark alley. It's a question of the surroundings. The emotive function, involving the emotions expressed by the senders. You usually get it when, people are having an argument or just having a civil conversation or, having a romantic interlude, there's usually some kind of emotional, right now it's like I'm calling a lot of my loved ones from out of town to see if they're all right, and there's a kind of to make sure that they're doing all right, and there's a kind of emotive dimension to it, and then the poetic function involving the use of literary devices such as metaphors and metonymy by senders, forms of different. What's the word I want? Plays of speech, different idioms that we use, different buzzwords, slang, different memes. It's like, 9-year-olds get this because all they do anymore is like communicate in like memes that I don't get. Things like, yeah, boomer or whatever. It's like, so there's all that, and then he'll compare he has his own model for this conduit of communication that he links up with both Laswell and Jacobson. Laswell's big thing is big, and he's most famous for, and we go into this in Intro to Communication. It's basically who says what is the content, and which channel, how is the speaker or the sender or the addresser communicating, to whom, who's my audience, and with what effect, right? And then, he lines it up with his artwork, medium, audience, and then he uses America for some reason, or society as being they don't really entirely link up, but Laswell and Jacobson seem to link up a lot better than Berger. I get it. I get the whole, but he's kind of got this kind of artistic orientation towards the whole thing. Then the idea of decoding. Because every code has got to get decoded. and an Italian guy, an Italian semiotician, and also a very, very famous writer by the name of Berger Ch.4. He wrote a book called Name of the Rose, and another one called Foucault's Pendulum, and a bunch of other stuff. But he also wrote a lot about semiotics and rhetoric, and he talked about this idea of aberrant decoding. Aberrant decoding basically being problems in communication. He says there's Umberto Eco, the distinguished Italian semiotician, suggested that when dealing with the mass media, we often find aberrant decoding, as audiences decode messages, that is, they interpret dialogue and events differently from what was intended. And I put this up here because I think this is a perfect example of the ways in which, for instance, you have a text war with somebody, your significant other or a friend, and you've got a lot emotionally invested in some argument or the relationship itself, and it's like, she or he will send a message, and you'll be picking apart what does she mean by this? What is that? Why? It's like, what is it? And there's a kind of inscrutability to texting that we're discovering, that it's not necessarily always the best way to communicate important things to people, due to the fact that they're so open to interpretation. Even with the whole arsenal we now have that was kind of added to texting of emoticons and different signs and symbols and shorthand, LOL and OMG, it's like to attempt to, what we're seeing a lot of times is a lot of these devices are actually causing more miscommunication than they are actual transparency, and it's just due to the nature of the medium. This often happens. Text wars. You know them. You hate them as much as I do. Another French guy. The French seem to be everywhere in the cognoscenti. They, for such a rather relatively small and inconspicuous country, they seem to have a lot of intellectuals. A guy by the name of Michel Descourteaux did a book called The Practice of Everyday Life, and Berger talks about it. He says, I did not want to, Buongiorno, come on. He says, Descourteaux says, he offers examples of subversions, how people will take the rhetoric or the rules or the discourse of, say, a conquering or a colonizing group of people. He uses the example of Spanish conquerors, how the Indians, he would explain, would seem to be submissive a lot of the times and consenting, but they subverted the various rituals and laws imposed on them. They repurposed them. For instance, you see a lot of, in Mesoamerica, you see a lot of different variations on Christianity that tend to be a mixture of earlier, more pagan or more naturalistic, nature religion, and all their attendant gods, and this happened all over the place during the period of Christian expansion, the ways in which indigenous people kind of like went Christian, but they kind of twisted it, For our purposes, think about, when you think about the subversion of communication, think about memes. Think about how kids, this is a good one too, the moment when you find the perfect avocado in the supermarket. I have a thing for Daenerys. Not really. She's cool. She's not really my type. Whole city destroying, I'm not really into like girls that destroy whole cities. It's not really. But this is good. The idea of memes as being a subversion, the ways in which we we talked about this, and we're going to talk about it more in image theory. The French term is détournement, which really means a turning or a flipping or an ironic kind of way that to repurpose something. Berger goes on and quotes another guy who writes a book called The Rhetorics of Popular Culture. Right? Now we're getting into this kind of rhetorical analysis of like it suddenly becomes clear that mass media and popular culture are fertile ground for rhetorical analysis, although for a long period of time they were thought not to be. And Root says here, in every case I will attempt to apply rhetorical analysis to a specific aspect of popular culture and repeatedly ask the same questions about them. What's the mode of presentation? How does the mode affect the presentation? What is the purpose of the discourse? Who is your audience? This is kind of repetitive, I know. How is the discourse directed at the audience? What person, and this is very interesting, what person is created as if rhetoric, as if, you know, the right film or the right speech or the right piece of art will literally create or change a person. This idea of affecting your subjectivity and some kind of, you know, and this is not too exaggerative. We're all, you know, there are films, and we talk about it all the time in class about films and music that changed our lives or saved our lives or some way, or gave us some new lease on life, you know, or some, you know, but that not just mainstream culture. Sometimes it's like, you know, you have a, you know, a discussion with a parent about the facts of life, or you're going through some hard stuff, you know, and it's like, you know, and you have these life-changing interactions with people, these pep talks, a coach or a mentor, or some type or another. I can remember the last conversation I ever had with my father on the phone before he passed. I remember his last words to me. I was bitching and moaning about something, money or something like that, and he was just kind of consoling me. He was like, "Yeah, he'll let her." It's like I owed somebody money, and he was like, "He'll work with you." It's like I can remember that. I can remember that conversation, and it lingers with me, and it changed my, and it kept me, and you know, these poignant, profound interactions that we have with not only media but other people. What's the argument? How is it arranged? And these are questions that you're going to have to be asking yourself at the book reports. When you look at the guidelines for the book reports, a lot of the questions that I'm asking you to ask of the book that you have chosen are kind of have to do with rhetorical analysis. Upon what is it based? Generally, these are questions of rhetoric which can be asked of any discourse, he says. These are things that any discourse has in common. Then Berger decides to put us through the academic root canal surgery of going through a lexicon of different devices that we use in rhetoric, a mini glossary. But it behooves us to engage in this really quickly. Let's not tarry, because a lot of this is just repetitive. Rhetorical devices, allegory. We've talked about allegory. Can be seen as extended metaphors in which the meanings of the event in a text lie outside of the text itself, right? The characters can be seen as personifications of abstract ideas. We do that for those of you that take my image theory class. You know, we watch The Matrix, and The Matrix, you know, we make a case for The Matrix being this allegory for modern life. You know, this is a still from another allegorical movie that some of you might have seen by John Carpenter called They Live. It's kind of like The Matrix. It's about these extraterrestrials that come down, and they're and they're using propaganda to control people with this mind ray, and it's got the it's got the wrestler Roddy Piper in it, which is awesome with his classic line. I came to kick ass and chew bubblegum, and I don't have any bubblegum. Alliteration. It's like you should have. It's like alliteration. Some of the things that you should have learned from the morons. I mean, ELA high school teachers that you had a scant time ago. Alliteration. Number of words in a passage starting with the same letter. And he uses magazines move millions, one mind at a time. That kind of rhythmic, easily. I mean, and this is gonna come into advertising slogans and jingles and all that. All these different devices are going to, once advertising gets up as a thing, they'll just run with all this kind of stuff. Allusions, not illusions, but allusions. Indirect references to things, places, ideas, social, political, or cultural significance. We make allusions. I make allusions to stuff all the time. I just made an allusion to this conversation I had with my father. I made an allusion to They Live. It's like it's embedded. It's like college lectures themselves are rhetoric. In the highest degree, are rhetorical in the highest degree. Number 4, ambiguity. Statements whose meanings can be several different things. It can be intended or inadvertent, but in both cases it can lead to misunderstandings. Ambiguity. When something is ambiguous. And I tend to differ here with him, that he seems to have just a kind of negative definition of ambiguity, but often in art, some of the best art kind of uses ambiguity to create a sense of mystery and wonder in this. It's like intentional ambiguity is not always a bad thing. Take for instance like the film 2001, which has all these symbols and the monolith and the guy gets old and movies like that where things are left ambiguous at certain times that we just intentionally because we're not supposed to get it, or it's supposed to act as what is called a cipher. Something is supposed to pose as something mysterious. And a lot of artists work with ambiguity. Somebody in the class is a real big fan of Rene Magritte. Rene Magritte was certainly a practitioner of ambiguity, as was people like Dali, or a lot of filmmakers use ambiguity in their stuff, whether it be like the horror genre or so there's ambiguity. Antithesis, opposition, or conjoining contrasting ideas. Thesis and antithesis, the joining of opposites, which can be, it's like we already talked about binary, how we see things, and semiotics. We talked about how we analyze genres sometimes in terms of binary oppositions, and how sometimes that can be limiting and misleading. For instance, the whole political. We're in a state in the world in terms of corporate global expansion and capitalism, where more and more people are talking about socialism, and a lot of people are out. There's hundreds upon thousands of people that are out there denouncing socialism as if you're throwing an F-bomb, like, oh, that's socialism. No, it's like this battle, and most of those people don't understand even what the tenets of socialism really are. They have these kind of basic, somewhat limiting understandings, but the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of different forms of capitalism that Marx talks about, and there's a lot of different forms of socialism. State centralized socialism means a lot of different things, and when we break things down and try to simplify them, sometimes it's not productive for us, in any kind of way, and this is kind of what went on in the 2016 debates between Sanders, using the S word, which up to that time had been a dirty word, and Hillary kind of representing this kind of saving of capitalism and branding, well, whatever. Number 6, comparisons. We compare things, and we compare this to that. It's like I compare, certain people to, how I have this like penchant for comparing certain elected officials as flesh-eating ghouls and goblins and demogorgons and the minions of Satan. The comparisons, right? Once again, he brings up de Saussure, the great semiotician. Meaning arises out of comparing something. I define something by what it's not. I define light, right? It goes right back down to the Bible. There was light, and then there was darkness, and blah, blah, blah. It's like you can never... And he uses, quite humorously, the line from a critic of his, writing a review of his book, Berger is the study of Berger is to the study of television what Idi Amin is to tourism in Uganda. In order to get it, you got to know who Idi Amin was. He was this like tribal chieftain in Uganda that cut a lot of people's heads off and caused a lot of havoc. Number 7, definition. Definition. We all know what a definition is. But he makes a distinction between definitions that are lexical, like what you look up in the dictionary, stipulative, which refers to a definition for the sake of argument. Like, for the sake of, for the sake of argument, I will define something as being this, And then operational definitions, or a list of operations to perform that will lead to an understanding of what is being defined. But I think that's very limiting, this whole idea of, it's like we operationalize concepts all the time in thesis and academic papers to get people to understand what we're talking about. Encomium. What's an encomium? That's a $5 word there. An encomium is basically praising something. Praising something for a thing based on its inherent qualities, right? Advertisements sometimes will, I think it's kind of pertinent considering the fact that people are selling their firstborn children on the black market right now for a 10 package of like Bounty paper towels. Bounty is Bounty was called, there was these commercials back in the day. Bounty was like the quicker picker-upper. It was a quicker picker-upper. And that's also like alliteration and rhyme. And then I like drew on a meme here that kind of plays on Bounty. This said Bounty Hunter, the Bounty Hunter. That's good. But encomiums to like celebrate. Encomiums celebrate a thing, even in songs, it's like the Commodores engage in an encomium here in a song called Brick House. Jonathan Cleveland will get this one. Lionel Richie's old band. Everybody knows this is how the story goes. She knows she's got everything that a woman needs. see with the Commodore's great classic Brick House how music and songs can also be a celebration of somebody's inherent qualities. Let's go back to the PowerPoints. It's just me. Come on, you guys. I'm going stir crazy. I gotta do something. Number 9 is euphemism. Euphemism, what's a euphemism? Using language that avoids terms that may seem offensive or inappropriate. Or another way of saying euphemism is sugarcoating something. Sugarcoating something. And there seems to be, in the wake of this current crisis that we are experiencing, a lot of euphemisms being used. But euphemisms, he uses one like, for instance, downside. It's like when people are fired, corporate culture and managers will say, well, you're being downsized. When really it's like you're just fired, right? You just got the boot. You lost your fucking job, right? This term always kind of bothered me and seems to have kind of taken hold, and I think it's going to become a more prevalent phenomena as the weeks and months move on. Food insecure. It's like food insecure, like popped up into our social rhetoric versus just when somebody's fucking starving. It's like, why do you gotta say food insecure? It's like it's like they're not food insecure in sub-Saharan Africa. They're starving. You don't have to dress it up. Number 10, exemplification. Exemplification is just using examples, like I just did. I use the example. You use examples. We do it all the time. Irony. Number 11, using words to convey the opposite of what they mean. We're being ironic, for instance, the guy on the bowling team, who is like 6'8" and they call him Shorty. It's like, I know that's stupid. Sarcasm, which seems to be Bonjourno stock and trade, I know, is a stronger form of irony that literally means the tearing of flesh. We've gone through these other ones. Metaphor is as opposed to simile. A metaphor is when you say the thing is the thing. It's not like the thing. My love is a rose. Metonymy uses associations to generate meaning, like a Rolls Royce is associated with wealth. These different associations people have with the good life. Back in the 80s, I went and dug this out this winter. I remember back in the 80s, you get a lot of like jocks and meatheads and just morons that would have different variations of this as like representing the good life, the curve of the woman and booze and the Lamborghini, how they're all kind of, similar and make allusions to each other. A paradox. What's a paradox? Paradox, Alan Watts gave the best definition of a paradox. He just said, paradox is the truth standing on its head. Paradox is the truth standing on its head. What Berger has to say here is that the term comes from the Greek paradoxon. It means contrary to expectations, beliefs, or opinions. Paradoxes seem to be self-contradictory, but often point to an important truth. Dictionary.com defines a paradox as a statement or proposition that seems self-contradictory or absurd, but in reality expresses a possible truth. And then he uses a quote from George Orwell's famous book Animal Farm, and it's kind of irony too here. He's being ironic, and it's also a paradox. All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. Rhyming. We all know what a rhyme is. I pulled out one of the hallowed, the great Edwardian lyric poet, Sir Mix-a-Lot. It's like some of you, I know Jonathan Cleveland will remember. I love big butts and I can't deny it. Some of you other brothers just don't buy it. And Sir Mix-a-Lot, he was knighted by Queen Victoria, the Queen at that time, hence the Sir, but an example. of rhymes. He also talks about rhythm. Rhythm refers to pattern and recurring alternative. I got bored of like actually hand typing these out and just started cutting and pasting them in. Rhythm, patterns, recurring alternations, various intervals. It's all about music. Can't have music without rhythm. It's got to have a beat. Everything. Any kind of music. Whether it's like a choral symphony or it's like hip hop or whatever. Simile, weaker form of metaphor. My love is like a rose, and we went through this. Synodoke, we went through this. It's a weaker form of metonymy in which part is used to stand in for the whole or vice versa. For example, we use the Pentagon to stand in for the entire American military establishment, or the White House to stand in for the American presidency. Alright? Somebody recently on the blog, I'm not going to name any names, made a reference to the idea that the president was going to be handing out money. The president himself is going to be handing out money, as if the president was going to like kind of reach into his pocket. No, it was like, and I wanted to respond to him that it's not the president that we're getting the money from. It's what the president stands in for, which is, the entire budget, the entire gross domestic product, the entire wealth of this nation, as a representative of that wealth. Understatement involves suggesting something is less important than it really is. Sometimes that's a device. We understate something to get an effect out of somebody, right? He goes on, and he does this very thorough analysis of this La Mer, defoliating cream for women with his French name, and he like just picks this thing to pieces throughout the text. He just does this thorough, but I would strongly suggest looking at the way that he picks this apart, because it is like, it's like if you want to learn how to do rhetorical analysis, it would seem as if he does a pretty good job of it here. I had a hard time finding the color picture because it's not color in the book, but he talks about the different elements of it, right? First of all, he talks about the text itself. He breaks it down. He breaks the text down. Sea to skin, daily transformation, creme de la mer jar, cell renewing. It's like all these different catchphrases and figures of speech that it uses, in a way to get people to buy it, And the interesting thing is that if you read it, you find out, or if you look on eBay, or look on Amazon, the shit is like ranges anywhere from like $450 to $550 for a little like container like this. So they better be goddamn good at the way they word this thing, because if you're gonna get somebody to buy something like that for that much money, you better have a public relations department that is just second to none. All right, and he breaks that down, and we don't have time to really break down the way that he does. He goes back to images. It's like things we got to think about when we're thinking about images. They're always composed of visual signs, right? Signifiers and signifieds, right? We talked about this in semiotics. Symbols, icons, indexes. All images have these components to them, all right? They can represent something real or imagined, It's like they can, up on my thing up here, I've got like this poster for Alejandro Jodorowsky's version of Dune, which is totally fictional, and this thing, which represents somebody that's supposedly the Buddha, representation, things that represent, you can represent unicorns, you can represent things that are real or things that are imagined. They generally contain objects and people in various places, and sometimes also words, right? Like a stop sign is an image, it contains a word. Other things contain words, like, the two signs on Titchener the other day, like, don't come in here or it's like, the two signs put up by public safety. If you come in here, we're gonna break your neck. It literally says that. We're gonna come to your house and we're gonna waterboard you. Because they do have a version down near the Natural Science Building. In the basement, there is this like place where they waterboard people and they make you stand. It's like this little mini Guantanamo that they take you to when you've done something like smoked a cigarette on campus or done something bad. They always generally contain objects and people in various places and sometimes also words. They generate meaning in those who see them. They have a denotational and a connotational significance. We talked about denotation and connotation. Bongiorno is running out of time. Talking about denoting something is just, this is the thing. You know, it's like, you know, the thing is the thing. You know, the globe, you know, this thing here represents the world, you know, but it also, what else is, I mean, it, you know, what is its connotations? I put it there intentionally for these lectures to be like scholarly, make it look like it was professorial. It's all bullshit, but I put it there, you know, to like represent the idea that, you know, and you'll see these shows too on PBS where people like Alistair Sims, like, you know, Masterpiece Theater, and they have to have these like old world clothes. They'll be on a pipe. I was thinking about having a pipe, smoking a pipe. I don't smoke a pipe anymore. I don't smoke that kind of pipe either, if you're curious. They often generate emotional responses. I'm going to finish up with this for now. Roland Barthes, another guy who was a famous... Roland is French, once again. Don't kill me, but once again. He wrote a book called Image, Music, and Text. And he did a lot of... And he really rethought, you know, the dynamics of rhetorical analysis. There are those who think the image is felt to be weak in respect of meaning. There are those who think the image is an extremely rudimentary system in comparison with language, and those who think that signification cannot exhaust the image's ineffable richness. You know, it's like the whole, what is he saying? You know, a picture is worth basically he's just restating the idea that sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. How does meaning get into the image? Where does it end? You know, and if it ends, what is there beyond the image? You know, it's very metaphysical. You know, we will start by making it considerably easy for ourselves. We will only study the advertising image. He wants to go and get into advertising. It's a book to check out, but Barthes is a really hard read. I've always wanted to kind of include some text by Barthes in image theory, and it's just, I've looked back at it and I'm just like, you know what? It's not to say that you guys aren't smart, because a lot of you guys are smarter than me, but it's just so dense. It's like I throw out enough stuff out there that's like really complicated. Yeah, and Berger brings up this Panzani ad for Panzani pasta. This is a famous rhetorical analysis that Barthes does, coming up with this idea of Italianicity. From the colors and the arrangement, the freshness, provided everything. I mean, it's like he does it falls within he talks about this. He's really like looking at this in terms of the effectiveness of this advertisement. You know, the still it partakes in the still life tradition. Those of you that take image theory know all about that. So we're gonna end there. We're gonna end there for now. Sorry if I'm a little bit off with this whole, like, you know, it's like subterranean bunker thing. You know, it's like my provisions are running out, and I'm gonna have to take my Jules Verne style drill back up to the surface here pretty soon. The oxygen is running low too, so I'm running low on oxygen, and I've been, like, you know, throwing caution to the wind by not wearing my my hard hat, you know. But let's finish up rhetoric next time, and we'll get into psychoanalysis, and hopefully we'll talk soon. I'm going to leave with down.